So thank you everyone for being here to commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Today is also the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Around the world, people are commemorating. I just this morning received photographs from Yannick Tona, who is a survivor of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, who's also featured in our exhibit. And he sent me photos of several hundred dignitaries, citizens, and activists commemorating International Holocaust Remembrance Day in Kigali, Rwanda, in Central Africa. That was a very powerful moment for me to think about the fact that in Central Africa they were commemorating this significant day. Near and far, we're mourning the senseless murder of millions of people, innocent people, and the loss of so many generations who could have come from them. At the same time, we're honoring our survivors, some of whom are in the audience today. And you've shared with us your stories of hope, bravery, resilience, compassion, and humanity in some of the darkest times in modern history, in world history. And so thank you for continuing to educate us, for sharing your stories with us, for making sure that we blaze a better path forward for our youth. Now together we are here tonight to gather and remember and reflect and experience a unique performance by Sari Boren, who's the daughter of our own Claire Boren. Thank you, Sari, for being here and also for sharing your art with us tonight. Thank you to community members Claire Boren and Vicki and David Portman, who sponsored tonight's event. And thank you also to our dessert sponsors, Dale and Dr. Stephen Daniels. Dale needs no introduction to this group. Doctors Nellie and Moshe Segal, Shelley and Mark Silverberg, Mimi and Jack Werbler, and Susan and Michael Yellen. And a special thank you also to Change staff, Allie Evans and Nicole Rizzuto, our new intern, Morgan Sim, and also the volunteers who helped us to make tonight possible. For those who have not yet met me, my name is Sarah Brown, and I am the new-ish Executive Director of the Center for Holocaust, Human Rights, and Genocide Education. And tonight's program is part of a 21-year history here at Change of innovative educational programming surrounding the Holocaust, various instances of genocide, and human rights. Our center was founded in 1979 by two professors, Dr. Cy Siegler and Jack Needle, who founded what was initially known as the Center for Holocaust Studies. 41 years later, Change has expanded both in size and in scope, but remain dedicated to our mission of eliminating anti-Semitism, racism, and all forms of prejudice through education about the Holocaust, other instances of genocide, and human rights. In addition to hosting dozens of programs all throughout the year that reach over 25,000 students, educators, and community members, our nonprofit organization is home to the permanent exhibit Journeys Beyond Genocide, which features the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, and the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. Our center also houses a 6,000-volume library dedicated to Holocaust and genocide studies, as well as the state's only archive for Holocaust and genocide. We welcome you to visit our center anytime. Come and learn more, get involved. Our doors are open and you're welcome. We also thank you for coming and joining us tonight. So tonight we're going to come together as a community, commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and also learn from Sari Boren's words and performance. Now I'd like to introduce Sari. Sari Boren has spent most of her professional life working in museums as an exhibit developer, telling historical stories, but she finds that the stories she still struggles with are those of her own family's history. As we commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day today, the solo show we're about to see asks questions about the legacies of the traumas of the Holocaust. How do the second and third generations of survivor families and the rest of the Jewish community, plus the non-Jewish community, honor and remember the Holocaust, while recognizing that these stories are not just historical stories, not just stories of our community, but also deeply personal stories of families? Sari is a writer and museum exhibit developer who has worked on over 50 museum exhibits across the country, including many sites for the National Park Service. Last year, she was a member of Company One Theater's Play Lab unit for emerging playwrights in Boston. Sari also teaches writing in Boston, and her essays have been published in numerous magazines, been awarded multiple grants, and her essay, The Slurry Wall, about an artifact at the 9/11 Museum, was named a notable essay in the Best American Essays of 2019. Sari attended Brandeis University and the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She was born and raised, though, here on the Jersey Shore and now lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Please join me in welcoming Sari.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. I'm Sari Boren. I have been a museum exhibit developer for 25 years, and I am thrilled to be here today at our annual conference to speak on this year's conference theme, Hands-Off Untouchable Exhibits. And the conference organizers did want me to tell you that if you ordered a box lunch, you can pick it up after my talk in the Regency room. Okay, let's get started. The 9/11 Memorial Museum is a failed museum. As a memorial, it's entirely appropriate, necessary. But as a museum, not so much. Why? Well, the museum is devoted to interpreting a world-changing historic event, and yet the museum is unconcerned with the day's place in history. It's ahistorical. I don't know, is the 9/11 Museum untouchable? See, the thing is, I actually wanted to talk to you today about some other exhibits, but the conference program committee, you all back there, they insisted that I talk about the 9/11 Museum, so here we are. Okay, I'm going to start with what I think is the museum's most basic problem. I don't know what visitors are learning at the 9/11 Museum. Of course, the exhibits are about what happened on September 11th, but the last time I was there, there was almost no interpretation about the effects of 9/11, about the Patriot Act, or wars started in retaliation. So how can we talk about this historic event if we don't talk about what happened in response, or what came before? History is a continuum. We do need to remember what happened, but the museum is mostly this exhaustive retelling of just one day. It's a three-dimensional scrapbook of misery and death. To what purpose? What is the museum's essential question? Let me explain what I mean by that. So whenever I start out working on a new history exhibit, like, say, the Bunker Hill Museum, early on, I need to identify what is the essential question the exhibit is asking. So for the Bunker Hill Museum, the question is, why do we commemorate a battle we lost? The essential question makes visitors think twice. Wait, we lost the Battle of Bunker Hill? So why did we build this gigantic monument? Let me give you another example. The battle at Concord's North Bridge. Now, you have to remember that the Minutemen, the colonists, they were still British subjects. And so they were firing upon the soldiers of their king's army. So the question is, were they patriots or traitors? The essential question opens up the story. Who's a patriot? Who's a traitor? And who gets to decide? I don't think the 9/11 Museum has an essential question. The only question it's answering is, what terrible things happened this day? Is that enough? I mean, imagine, for example, if a Holocaust museum only showed terrible things, just violence and death, but it didn't interpret the history of anti-Semitism in Europe or Jewish cultural life before the genocide. How could visitors begin to understand the Holocaust, if such a thing is understandable? You see, I went to Berlin not that long ago. I wasn't on a work trip, but I was with my family, and they have all these sites that interpret the Holocaust, but there's no one place to get the comprehensive story. So you have to go like on a pilgrimage from site to site and pull it all together yourself. And when I saw those exhibits in Berlin, I was just wondering, how effective are they? And that's really what I wanted to talk to you about today, but the conference committee thought my 9/11 talk was more relevant. All right, where was I? Patriots or traitors? Freedom fighters or terrorists? Without a question like this guiding the interpretation at the North Bridge exhibit, visitors might leave just saying, the Minutemen were awesome. What are visitors leaving the 9/11 museum saying? Terrorists are bad? So, why isn't there an essential question at the 9/11 museum? First, it was built too soon. We were still too deep in it. We couldn't see our place in the larger timeline of historic events. I'm not really a fan of timelines in exhibits, but maybe this museum could have used one. And second, was the museum afraid to ask an essential question? Like, are we safer if we trust or fear our neighbors? Can democracy withstand the strains of terrorism? If you don't want to hear the answer, you don't ask the question. Let me ask you all a question. How often do you think we're getting it right when we make exhibits? See, I've had critiques about the 9/11 museum from the start, but it's when I saw those exhibits in Berlin, I really started to wonder, how often are we getting it right? And I don't mean getting the history right. I mean, if we say that we're trying to provide understanding for something like the Holocaust, are we saying that the Holocaust is understandable in a 2-hour museum visit? What option do we have to dump visitors into a misery scrapbook like the 9/11 museum? I don't know. All right, sorry, I got a little off track there. I wanted to talk about the exhibit techniques that we use to support the essential question, like text and images, artifacts, interactives, timelines. I'm not really a fan. I said that. Well, I'm not really a fan of timelines and exhibits, but I understand why visitors like them. They unspool history in an orderly way. They're neat and linear, but there are problems. First, where do you start? Where along the timeline is the point of origin of your story? So for example, for a World War II timeline, do we start with the Treaty of Versailles or Hitler's rise to power? And another problem with timelines is they're neat and linear. And so they seem to illustrate cause and effect. But one event does not just directly lead to the next event down the line. And causes can hover out of reach, or they can converge from many places all at once. What about your own life? Could you understand it better through a timeline? It would be factual, orderly, but could it help you understand your own story? And what would be the precipitating event? Your birth or the blind date your parents met on? Or a war? Okay, so we all know that a history exhibit is a reduction by design, a distillation. We can't fit the whole story into an exhibit, and we wouldn't want to. Not just because of the limitations of space and budget, but because of the limitations of the visitor's attention. The visitors are all reading, standing up. Their kids are clamoring for juice boxes. We need to consider the visitor experience. Have pity on the visitor. Actually, like me, I mean, if you had seen me when we were at this exhibit in Berlin, you know what, I'm just gonna show you. Hold on. I have these photos from Berlin. Oops, hold on. Okay. That is not a flattering photo of me. I'm standing in front of an exhibit that has photos of the Jews of my mother's hometown in Poland being shot into a ditch, the actual photos of them being murdered. And I don't know how to pose with resting, serious face, flattering, serious face. I don't know how to do that. The visitor experience. Okay, let me get back to that. Yeah, so when we talk about the visitor experience, we need to consider what is the visitor going to think and do and feel. I mean, what was I supposed to feel watching my mom point out photos of her parents to a bunch of German reporters? Look, I know I'm supposed to be talking about the 9/11 Museum and the essential question, but what more is there for me to say? It doesn't have an essential question, right? So I think I've covered it, okay? So I'm just going to show you these. I'm going to show you the exhibits I want to. Hold on. All right. Oops, sorry. So two parts of my life collided on this trip. Can you still hear me? Okay. My professional work in museums and my family's history. We were in Berlin because my mother was invited as a special guest to the opening of a new Holocaust exhibit. Both of my parents are Holocaust survivors, and my mom spent the war in hiding, and my dad was in the camps. And this is a photo of me, my mom, and some other family members that were posing in front of the iconic Berlin Olympic Stadium that the Nazis built. Smile. We were staying in a brand new hotel in Berlin in this part of the city called Potsdamer Platz that was completely rebuilt after reunification. It's very modern, very shiny. They have protected bike lanes everywhere. They're protecting the bikes. So nice. And this is the museum that was hosting the exhibit we were invited to, the Topography of Terror Museum. There's no lawn, just rocks. Topography of Terror, catchy. Those Germans, so clever. I mean, why not just call it, no one wanted to build a cafe atop the ashes of the SS headquarters, so we figuratively salted the earth and made exhibits about the perpetrators instead? Too long? I hadn't been to Berlin before. The last time my mom went through Berlin was right after the war when she was with her family, and they were on their way to a displaced persons camp in another part of Germany where they would live for 3 years. Here, I'll show you. So that's my mom there, the taller one. And she's with her younger sister, Bina, who was born after the war. This is before they came to the United States. Refugees or infiltrators? My mom spent much of the war in hiding with her mother. After they had escaped the roundup of the Jews in their hometown, they spent months hiding in the woods with other Jews until one day some Ukrainians came and they were posing as partisans so they could lure the Jews away and kill them. But luckily, my grandmother recognized them, and she lied to them, and she said she knew where some other Jews were hiding, and she would go get them, and so she was able to escape with my mother, who was 4 or 5 years old at the time. And at another point, a Christian family hid them in their barn, and my mom and grandmother spent months hiding in a hole that was dug under the pigsty that was so small they couldn't both sit upright at the same time. And in that sensory-deprived environment, my mom began hallucinating, and the Christian family thought she was possessed by the devil. So my grandmother decided it was time for them to leave. And now my mom's an artist. She painted in watercolors for years, mostly landscapes and flowers, but when she was in her 50s, her art changed. And she started making abstract oils and collages. And her work expresses, often unconsciously, her memories of that year and a half of her childhood that she spent in hiding in Poland, in houses and in attics and in the woods and in that hole dug under the pigsty in the barn. And I helped my mom write her artist statements. In one of them, she says, of the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust, 1.5 million were children. Only 11% of Jewish children survived. She says, I am one of the 11%. But we weren't invited to the exhibit in Berlin because of my mom's art. Not exactly. Here, I'll show you why. And I do have a picture of me that I like from this trip. Okay, so this is me and my mom the night of the exhibit opening. We're about to meet the German foreign minister, and I am filled with quiet delight that my mother is wearing a black leather shirt for the occasion. And this is the exhibit that we've been invited to at the Topography of Terror, Mass Shootings, the Holocaust from the Baltic to the Black Sea, 1941 to 1944. So you see, it's only relatively recently that scholars have determined that of the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust, about 2 million were shot by roving Nazi killing squads. And not just the enthusiastic all-in Nazis, but the 19 and 20-year-old foot soldiers. And on this map, the squares are showing all the towns where at least 500 people were shot, including my mom's hometown of Mizoch. You see there in the bottom, in the center, Mizoch, in what was formerly Poland. And so that's why the curators have made this exhibit, because all these years, the Germans could tell themselves that it was the elite Nazis, the Gestapo and the SS, that carried out the genocide, but it was also ordinary men drafted into the regular army. It was regular Germans. So my mother has been invited as a special guest because there are photos showing the Jews of her town of Mizoch being shot into a ditch. And so Mizoch is interpreted in greater detail in the exhibit because these photos exist. And so here is my mom pointing out a photo of her parents from before the war. Do you know how strange this was for me? All these years I've been making exhibits, like dozens and dozens of exhibits, and then I come to Berlin and another exhibit developer has put my family in an exhibit. The grandfather I never knew, that's him on the far right in that photo. My mother's father, Yosef, he was killed. And next to him is my grandmother, my mother's mother, Anne. She survived. And at the bottom there where my mom is pointing, she's pointing to her childhood dog. I didn't even know my mom had a dog. I don't know what happened to the dog. I seem to have a lot of complicated feelings about this trip that I haven't really sorted through yet. You know, I'm not one of those people where I have an emotional experience and then I post about it online the next day. You know, crying face emoji, hands up emoji. Maybe I need to get over myself and my complicated feelings. Or maybe it's just too soon since the trip. You know, I'm too close to it, like the 9/11 museum. But there was a time when none of this touched me emotionally. Not even photos of terrible things. I asked my mom once, when was it that I first knew about the Holocaust? And she said, always. You always knew. Which makes sense. I mean, I always knew the way I always knew we lived in New Jersey, or I always knew we were Jewish. I mean, I knew it, but I didn't feel it. When I was 9 or 10 years old, I made a Holocaust photo album with photos from a concentration camp, and I brought it to Hebrew school for show and tell. My dad, after he was liberated, he had taken a roll of film off a Nazi, and he had the photos developed. And he kept these photos in a small leather suitcase, a valise he called it, up on the top shelf of our living room closet next to our vacation slide carousels. Here I am. I wish I could reconstruct the state of mind that led me to drag the piano bench over to the closet and pull down the valise and start sorting through the photos and picking out the ones that I liked. You know, the old photos, the old black and white photos, they were smaller than, well, they were just a little bigger than these Post-it notes. And they had white borders. Remember how photos used to have those? And I picked out the photos and I taped them down to sheets of green construction paper. And then I stapled the pages together, and I brought the photo album to Hebrew school for show and tell. And I don't think my mother knew anything about this little craft project. These were the original and only prints, but also she would have had the sense to keep them from being shown to a classroom of 9-year-olds, mediated only by another 9-year-old. What did I say when I stood in front of that class and held up the album and turned the pages? These are real photos. These things that look like piles of logs, those are dead bodies. Those are the Jews the Nazis killed. And this dark hole, that's an oven. That's where they burn the bodies. A Nazi took these photos. Did the other kids raise their hands and ask questions, or did the teacher intervene? I stood up in front of that class and I showed and told those photos like I was the teacher, but I was a 9-year-old girl who could show photos from a Polish concentration camp like the one her father had survived and feel nothing, except how I felt having those photos. I knew they were powerful, and I reveled in that power. But there was no fear or sadness. Not when I stood in that classroom, not when I read books about the Holocaust or watched movies. I didn't even realize that I had built those defenses that let me look at those photos and feel nothing when I was 9 years old. But 30 years later, when my dad published his Holocaust memoir, everyone says it's really well written. I don't know. I haven't read it. Everyone else has read it. My friends have read it. My dad wanted me to read it. When he asked me why I hadn't read it, I said, "It's hard for me to read." He said, "It's not so hard to read." I tried. I did. The first 50 pages or so are manageable, but then forget it. When did that happen in those 30 years? When was it that my defenses fell away and I couldn't deal with the Holocaust anymore? Is that my essential question? When was it that I could no longer consume the Holocaust anymore? And how would I figure that out? I don't know when that is. Maybe I need to make a timeline. Okay, it's just a tool. Here, let me. Okay. Wow, I have totally hijacked my talk. I'm holding you all hostage. But if I'm telling stories about the Holocaust, you can't really leave, can you? Okay, let's do this. 1964, I'm born. In elementary school, I read every book about the Holocaust in the children's section of the local library. So that's the early 1970s. In fact, I read my way through the entire children's section of the library. And then Well, in 1973, when I'm 9, I make that Holocaust photo album. Then what? Well, a few years later, the miniseries Holocaust is broadcast on television. That's probably like the late 70s. And the Asbury Park Press sends a reporter to our house to interview, my parents and me and my brother as we watch Holocaust on television. And I can talk about it the next day at school, but more like a TV critic, not like a survivor's daughter. And what? I don't know. Well, there's Schindler's List. When that came out, that was the 90s. And an hour before I'm supposed to meet my friends at the movies, I back out. I can't make myself go. Before that, I could watch movies about the Holocaust. Wow, it's like a big gap there. And then 2004, my dad publishes this Holocaust memoir. I'm 40 years old. I can't read past page 50. The book that my dad inscribes for me, it sits on my coffee table for weeks, maybe months, and I pile mail and magazines on top of it until I can no longer see the photo of my dad on the cover, a young man at Liberation. The photo, that's from his ID card that the American Army issued to former concentration camp prisoners. And I have photos of that because I use it when I give talks about artifacts. You know how artifacts are powerful, like those photos I brought to Hebrew school, and how if you get to physically touch an artifact, it's like a bridge to the past. Here. Okay, so this is the front, and I'm just going to get off here for a second. Hold on. So do you see down here in the bottom corner? Can you see it over there? The American Army, they recorded the number that the Nazis had tattooed on his arm. Why would they do that? And this is the back. And there it says, former residence, Warsaw. Although he liked to tell people he was from Texas. And they believed him. Whenever my dad would get into a cab, he'd ask the cab driver, "Where are you from?" Because he loved talking to other immigrants. And they'd hear his accent and ask him right back, "Where are you from?" Well, unless they were from Eastern Europe, in which case they'd say, "You from Russia?" And he would switch to Russian, maybe chat with them a bit, and recite a few lines of Yevtushenko's poetry he had memorized in grade school. But then he'd say, "No, Polak," which was the truth, but not the whole truth. But to the Pakistanis and Algerians and the rest who drove cabs in New York who didn't recognize my dad's accent, to them he'd say Texas. And it seems highly improbable that anyone who met my dad would mistake him for a Texan. I mean, his accent was not subtle. He pronounced the word three like tree. But he wore these cowboy boots all the time, really authentic boots, and a cowboy hat. But it wasn't just this outfit, his get-up, he liked to call it. He wore the bravado of a successful immigrant, which wasn't that far off from a Texan's bravado. And he had a love for America that would outshine that of a native-born American. So the book, yeah. The book my dad inscribed for me, it sat on my coffee table for months. There are other copies on my dresser. There might have been others throughout the house. And I ignored them, forgetting altogether that they existed until maybe one day I was straightening up the coffee table and I'd see it, or if my dad called for help with his computer. And when I was trying to explain to him once again how to save a file, and I was saying, "No, Dad, the file hasn't disappeared. You have to tell the computer where to put it." And I'd feel guilty for my impatience. And my guilt was like a beacon, a tracking device. And I became aware of books lurking throughout the house, like neat rectangular landmines. In 1941, my teenage father and his older brother Mjajtek and their father traveled from their home in Warsaw to Ukraine. They'd hoped to salvage something of my grandfather's business, to liquidate some capital, because after the Nazis had invaded Poland, their assets had been frozen. And when I was little, this story came to me in bits and pieces, and so I tried to paper over the gaps and the complexities with a child's literal logic. My grandfather was a chemist, and he did something with dried fruit. So I thought they were going to Ukraine to protect a dried fruit factory. Knowing what was coming next, I thought, forget about the fruit. Stay home. Months later, they tried to return to Warsaw under false papers, but some Ukrainians betrayed them, and the Nazis captured them and imprisoned them in a cell with other Jews. Weeks passed, until one day they saw gallows being built in the yard. But before that happens, before the gallows, they're in this cell, the three of them, meant to hold maybe 10 people, but there's about 40 Jewish men or boys in this cell, and it turns out that one of the men is my dad's French teacher from these months they've been living in Ukraine. And the teacher tells my dad a story one night in the cell about a young Jew in Tsarist Russia about to be inducted into the army. And it goes like this. If the army will reject me, that will be fine. But if I'm inducted into the army, I'll have two ways out. Either they will keep me in the rear, or they will send me to the front. If they keep me in the rear, that will be fine. But if they send me to the front, I have two ways out. Either I will kill the enemy, or the enemy will kill me. If I kill the enemy, that will be fine. But if the enemy kills me, I have two ways out. Either I will go to heaven, or I will go to hell. If I go to heaven, that will be fine. If I go to hell, I have two ways out. Either I will eat the devil, or the devil will eat me. If I eat the devil, that will be fine. But if the devil eats me, I have one way out. My dad told this story a lot. To us and at dinner parties, to him it was proof that he had outwitted the devil himself and planned to keep doing so. My dad was full of stories like these, stories and songs. He lived a big life after the war, a generous life. Although sometimes the pain of what he lived through exploded out of him and onto us. 50 years after those gallows were built, I visited that prison building in Ukraine with my parents. It's a school now. Who turns a prison into a school? And there's a plaque outside. It says that people were killed here during the war. They were hung. But it says Polish people. It doesn't say Jews. And this makes my dad really upset because his father and brother were killed here because they were Jews. A local man is showing us around, and out in the dusty schoolyard, there's a poorly constructed jungle gym of thin metal poles, red ones and blue ones. And as I stare up at the high bar, a crossbar between two uprights, the man says that the bodies from the hangings may be buried here, under the jungle gym. I did go to my dad's book launch. I took the train down from Boston to the Jersey Shore, where my parents live, to the Jewish Community Center. And there's a lot of people here, but except for our close friends and family, I don't remember their names. This is a trait I share with my dad, not remembering names. It's easier for them. I'm Adam and Claire's daughter. So I keep saying, thank you for coming. It's so nice to see you, because it works for people I don't know and for people I should know. It's a good trick. And my brother couldn't make it, so I'm on my own. My dad said he wrote the book for us, for me and my brother. And my dad is sitting at a table signing books with a fancy pen I got him for his birthday. He usually hates it when we get him gifts. He says if he wants anything, he'll get it himself. He says the best gift we ever got him was a shoehorn with a really long handle. A man with a yarmulke approaches me. He introduces himself. I immediately forget his name. He's a rabbi, and he's very excited to meet me because I'm Adam and Claire's daughter. And he explains that he's the principal of a yeshiva, a private Jewish high school in North Jersey, in Patterson. And he says that everyone at the school is very excited about my dad's book. They've read it already? He said they're using the book to put on a play. Another rabbi joins us, another teacher from the school, and the two of them in tandem continue to praise my dad's book, and they're talking and talking and talking and talking. And I don't know, for some reason I start to feel like they're shoe salesmen from Brooklyn or Queens. And I know I should be delighted by their enthusiasm and appreciative on my dad's behalf, but I'm not buying it, whatever they're selling. It's too much. It's like we're the artifacts they're getting to touch. Or maybe that's me just deflecting, because the guilt is crawling all over me in that room. The rabbis are more excited about my dad's book than I am. They've already read the book, that I can't, that I won't. One day at the Ukrainian prison, they send all the men and boys outside at a run. And the afternoon is darkening into evening, and it has that kind of light, I imagine, where it starts to get difficult to tell objects apart. So the edge of a building bleeds seamlessly into the ground, and a fast-moving blur against the wall could be the shadow of a tree branch, or a sudden cloud of dust, or a boy running. They've ordered all the men and boys, including my father and his brother and father, to run around the outside of the building towards the gallows that were built for them. And as they round the corner of the building, my teenage father splits off and runs into a shed. And he hides there, listening to the sounds of men praying, his father and brother among them, chanting the Shema before they're hung. Right before that scene, that's when I stopped reading my dad's book. It's not that I don't know the stories. I've been told the stories. I even videotaped my parents telling their stories for a film class I took in college, but once I turned in the assignment, I never watched it again. And I haven't watched the video interviews my parents made with Steven Spielberg's Shoah Project, because it's not a history project. It's not an exhibit. It's my family. Sometimes people forget that. Back at my dad's book launch, after he's finished talking about the book, he's signing books again, and the principal from the yeshiva finds me again. And, you know, I want to be a good host, a good daughter, so I ask him, when's the play? Even though I don't really want to know. And he tells me it's this spring, May 16th. And he expects, of course, that I'll be there. And I ask him who writes the play, one of the teachers? And he tells me that the students write it, that they have a system in place, that every year they write and they put on another Holocaust play. And he keeps talking. He says, your father's book, all of it, it's too long, of course. The important scenes, those are the ones we'll keep. And then he says to me, we'll keep, of course, the scene where your father finds out his mother has been killed, and the scene when his sister dies, and of course, after they escape, when he escapes and his father and his brother are hung, and my hands go numb. And I imagine a high school auditorium. And on the stage, I see a painted plywood shed leaning against the back wall, and there's a teenage boy in a costume from last fall's production of Fiddler on the Roof. And he crouches inside the shed, listening to his father and brother die. And then, at a key heroic moment, he balances a box atop an overturned wheelbarrow and scales the prison fence and makes his escape into the wintry night. And I see these 14 and 15-year-olds acting out the murders of my family, of the family I've never met, the family I'm named after, the family I look like. And I am very certain I will be nowhere near a high school auditorium in Paterson, New Jersey on the night of May 16th. And that was over 10 years ago. And I still haven't read my dad's book. It was published by the U.S. Holocaust Museum, so a lot of people have read it, so maybe it's okay that I haven't read it. But there are things I wanted to know, like, why did my dad talk all the time about his mother and his sister Mina, but never about his brother Myatek? I wondered about Myatek and about my mom's dog, but I never asked about the dog. You see, there's all these people like me, children of survivors, and they write memoirs about hunting down the mysteries of their family's past and opening up the secrets and the silences, and they travel to the old country and they research in archives, but I never shared those impulses. I recoiled from them. So even though I wondered about my dad's brother, I never asked him. And now that my dad has died, I never can. My mom said to me once that she wondered whether they had told us too much when we were too young. But who's to say what's worse, the wondering or the knowing? There's a question with no right answer. I said I was going to show you all the exhibits from Berlin, and I haven't done that, so have you been to the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin? The Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe. That's what it's called. Looks like gravestones. I do appreciate that they use the word murdered. When my dad was dying, he asked me to have a stone marker made to be laid at the foot of his grave with the names of his mother and father and sister and brother and the dates of their births and their deaths and the words murdered in the Holocaust, because they weren't killed as civilian casualties of war. They were murdered. And this would be the grave marker they never had. And on his headstone, we had it engraved in Hebrew, his lineage, Avraham, son of Yisrael and Sarah, and in English, beloved husband and father, a voice of conscience, naming those he came from and those he left behind. So, the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe. To the murdered Jews. What is with the Germans and these names? To the murdered Jews, like an offering, a gift? Sorry about the genocide, here's a memorial. You think I'm being too harsh? Do you know, nowhere at the memorial does it say who murdered the Jews. Someone murdered them. Who could it be? I know, they assume, you assume that everybody knows that it was the Nazis who murdered the Jews along with their collaborators in Ukraine and Poland and Hungary, etc. But not that long from now, people won't know. And maybe they'll say, oh, the gypsies murdered the Jews, or the Jews murdered each other. The father of the current prime minister of Poland has said that the Polish Jews went into the ghetto voluntarily to get away from the Polish people. And just last March, there was a Polish nationalist rally in New York City, and someone there said that the Jews in the ghettos murdered each other. And 100 years from now, when the survivors are long gone and their children like me have died as well, and if physical museums even still exist, what will a visitor to a Holocaust museum think when they read about 1.5 million murdered Jewish children? Will they try to draw false equivalencies to the thousands of children who died in the flu pandemic of 2043? Or will they say, 1.5 million? Couldn't be that many. And murdered? I don't know. Those Jews, those shtetl Jews, they lived in those filthy shtetls. I think those Jews neglected their children. I think those children died of disease, and not so many, not 1.5 million. You all know what I'm talking about, right? Working in museums? Have any of you worked on exhibits about slavery? Because I have, and 150 years after the end of the Civil War, I still have to explicitly write in the exhibit text that slavery was the cause of the Civil War, because there's so many visitors who refuse to face that truth. So, what will the exhibit developer of the future do to push back against the willful misconceptions about the Holocaust? There is a visitor center below the memorial. It's underground, and it does have some of the most emotionally affecting exhibits I have ever seen about the Holocaust. In this room, they have letters and diary entries of people writing who were anticipating their imminent deportations and deaths. It stops your breath. And I leave this exhibit feeling that the people murdered have been seen. But this exhibit is really easy to miss. There's almost no signs pointing you there, and you literally walk over it. And we also went to the Jewish Museum that has a large permanent exhibit about the history of Jews in Germany, but it's out of order. It starts with the Holocaust. And I'm not sure why that is, except maybe it's that the history of the Jews in Germany is so long that in their chronological exhibit, by the time you get to the Holocaust, you'd be too exhausted to deal with it. So they put it first. So we went to the Jewish Museum and to the Visitor Center under the memorial, and we went to a whole bunch of different sites in the Jewish Quarter, and of course the topography of terror, because like I said, you had to go from site to site to sort of get the whole story. Maybe you're wondering, how is a Holocaust museum different from the 9/11 museum? They both recount atrocities, but they're not the same. 9/11 was deliberately planned as a public act of terror. The perpetrators flaunted their crimes, and the museum recounts these crimes in explicit detail. But the Holocaust was meant to disappear people, to vanish an entire culture, as if we never existed. And so Holocaust museums counter that with every story and photo of a person murdered. So what would be the essential question of a Holocaust museum? How do we know the Holocaust happened? What's the tipping point of genocide? How do you convince neighbors to turn on each other? And what about my essential question? When was it that I could no longer deal with the Holocaust anymore? I mean, it's somewhere. Oh, I forgot something. Hold on. When I was in college, in the 1980s, I went to see the movie Sophie's Choice. And when I was in the theater, Meryl Streep's perfect Polish accent, it struck me like a tuning fork, because she sounded like my dad and his cousins. She sounded like home. But also there's that scene, you know, where Sophie has to choose between her children, and I'm watching it, and I realize that I'm closer in age to Sophie than to her children. And there's something about that. And the movie wrecks me, but Sophie's not my mom. She's not even a real person. And hours later, when I call my mom, still crying, I can't explain what I'm crying about, because I've never cried about my mom's story. So, all right, so it's here, somewhere here, I guess, in the 80s, that's when I couldn't deal with the Holocaust anymore, but why then? I mean, what? Let's see. That's That's really my essential question, not when. It's why. What happened there? What happened that changed? Whatever happened, it's still with me. I still can't read my dad's book. And why was it so hard for me to be in Berlin? It was so much harder than it was for my mom. When we were there, they had this press preview at the Topography of Terror Museum the day before the exhibit opened. And there were all of these German reporters there asking my mom questions. And one of them asked her, "How does it feel to be in Berlin?" And my mom said, "It's okay. It's fine. The Germans have done so much to own the past, to take responsibility and teach it to the next generation. And all over the city, there are these markers to their crimes, plaques and pop-up exhibits. And by the subway, there's a sign with the names of the concentration camps. And it says, 'Places of horror we must never forget.'" And I'm watching my mom answer the German reporters in her open-hearted, easygoing way. And I look back and I see the German curators, and they're all shaking their heads because they don't think the Germans have done enough. I agree with them. Well, because my mom may feel fine here, I don't. When I was first planning this trip, all my friends were like, "Berlin, it's so exciting, it's so cutting edge, it's like the way New York used to be back when New York mattered." And I get here, and it feels to me like the whole city is sullied by this persistent grime of history. When we're walking around, I see this sign on a building, that old Nazi-era typeface, and it creeps me out. And when we're in the Jewish quarter, every Jewish school has a standing police presence in front of it. And we go to a flea market one day, and there's this table piled high with antique dolls, and I wonder about the little girls they belong to. And so when we go to a restaurant one night, and this German waitress is like flinging plates of schnitzel onto our table with barely concealed irritation at us Americans, it's a relief, because I can let myself hate her a little without feeling too bad. Because besides from the waitress, every single German I personally interact with, the curators and the reporters and the shopkeepers, they're all kind and generous and lovely. Whatever. I can't wait to leave. One day I'm crossing through Potsdamer Platz, which we've done like a dozen times this week, but this day I'm on my own, and I stopped to look at a freestanding exhibit that's titled "The War of Annihilation Against the Soviet Union, 1941 to 1945." And it's placed right by the subway entrance where swarms of Berliners are hurrying past it. Maybe it needs a better title. And I'm reading about the War of Annihilation because it's translated into English when I notice a photo that looks familiar. A large cluster of people trapped in a dark, snaking ditch. And the caption reads, "Mizoch, formerly Poland, now Ukraine, 14 October 1942. The shooting of 1,000 Jewish women and children by members of the security police and the SS security service." So here are the Jews of my mother's town of Mizoch, captured on film right before they're all shot. And I'm standing in front of it on this gloriously sunny day in Berlin, and over my shoulder is the Sony Center and the Berlin Film Museum, where the film festival is going to take place in a few weeks. And I know I should be grateful to whatever part of the German government that has decided to put this exhibit in the public square, but what is this doing here? Is anybody stopping to give a moment of thought to the Jews of Mizoch? And why would they? People are late for their trains. Why is this here? So the Germans could wrap up the past in a professionally designed exhibit and anchor it in cages of rocks and wipe their hands of it? Don't worry, I'm not going to show you the photos of the Jews of Mizoch being shot, but you can Google it. It's online, which is where the curators found my mom, online. on her artist's website, where she has an entire category of her art that was inspired by her memories and experience in the Holocaust. So that's why we're in Berlin, because the curators of the Topography of Terror could Google Mizoch and find my mother in New Jersey making art. Well, and because my mom hired this nice young woman to build her a website. And because back in Mizoch, when my mother's father heard there was going to be a roundup of the Jews, he paid someone to hide them all. And because after the roundup, after someone in the town had betrayed him, and my grandfather was killed, and he couldn't return to his family, my grandmother found the strength and ingenuity to keep finding them places to hide. And because when they were hiding in the woods and the Ukrainians came posing as partisans so they could take the Jews away and kill them, my grandmother tricked them and they escaped. And because one night when my grandmother left my mother all alone so she could go back and sneak back into the now Jew-free town of Mizoch and dig up the valuables her husband had buried, she wasn't caught. And my 5-year-old mother, who spent the whole night huddled alone in the dark, listening to the sounds of bombs falling, wasn't left alone to fend for herself. And because after spending months hiding in an attic so that for months afterwards my mother barely spoke, they were finally liberated by the Russian army. And because after the war, when my mother got diphtheria, my grandmother had already reconnected with a man from her town. The man I grew up with is my grandfather, Emil. And Emil was able to trade on the black market for penicillin. And because my mom actually thrived during the 3 years they lived in the displaced persons camp in Germany. And because they finally received visas to emigrate to the United States and settle in New York. And because after she was married, my mother started speaking publicly about her experiences as a child in the Holocaust, and people wrote newspaper stories about her. And because after years of painting pretty watercolors, my mother began dredging up her memories and rendering them in thick oils and layered collages and showing her work in galleries. Because of all this, I find myself in Berlin on a busman's holiday, an exhibit developer in an exhibit that features the photos of my fashionable grandmother and the grandfather I never knew, and my mother's childhood dog, and the mostly dead Jews of Mizoch, where Jews had lived for over 300 years. So that's my mom's timeline, I suppose, and mine. I don't know, does it make any sense tunneling back through time like that? I mean, how is it that my mother could live through all that? And she was more comfortable in Germany than I was. She was a little girl back then, not me. One day when we were in Berlin, we all went down to walk along the train tracks that had taken away the Jews of Berlin. Little girls no different from my mom. Little girls who hadn't been able to walk the streets of this city without fearing for their lives. And when my father was a teenager in that Ukrainian prison, there's that moment, his decision, quicker than a breath, to run off, to stop following his father and older brother. How did he do that? And the thing is, I don't want to put myself in his shoes. I don't want to imagine what it was like and hear the shouts of the guards. I don't want to think about my father in that Ukrainian prison or think about my mother lying in a hole in the ground. I want to keep my parents in their place where they belong. I want to keep my father at the head of the dinner table telling me to hold my knife and fork properly and not cut my food like an animal, or in his favorite armchair after dinner, working through the puzzles in Scientific American, or zooming down the ski slopes with wild abandon. And that's where he belongs, and not in a Ukrainian prison or in the basement of a burning building in the Warsaw Ghetto, or all alone after the war, a young man who's lost his entire family. And I want to keep my mother in her place where she belongs, standing in front of a canvas with her hands smeared with oil sticks, or walking along the beach on the Jersey shore, picking up driftwood to bring back to her studio, or just lying in bed with her coffee in the New York Times. And that's where she belongs. And not all alone in the night, listening to bombs falling, wondering if her mother will ever come back for her. I cannot bring myself to watch that play in Paterson, New Jersey. And I can't bring myself to read my father's book. I can't bring myself to look at my dad in that Ukrainian schoolyard as we stand beside the jungle gym and wonder who might be buried beneath the crisscrossing poles. When my parents and I have changed places, when I have become the caregiver and they're the ones needing care, I've accepted this as the natural course of our lives. But this place in the timeline, when I'm older than my parents were during the war, when I'm old enough to see them as children, that's why I can't watch the movies or read the books. When I try to read my dad's book or imagine my mother lying in that hole, he is the child and I am the adult. She's in danger and I am helpless. They are lost and I am beyond their reach. I cannot reach back through the tunnel of time, not with my exhibits or my writing or my love. I cannot rescue them and carry them away, not just from the danger, but from ever having to know the danger exists. I see my parents as children in the most unbearable of situations, and I cannot watch them live through it, even knowing that they live. So that's why. That's the answer to my essential question: why can't I deal with the Holocaust anymore? It's when I'm old enough to see my parents as children. So am I done here? I don't know. Somehow it doesn't feel like I'm done. I mean, everything I've said so far is true, but still, why was it so much harder for me in Germany than it was for my mom? Maybe it wasn't just Germany I wanted to get away from. Maybe I wanted to get away from myself. It's easier to be angry at the Germans, to leave Germany. I can't leave myself. Why can't I deal with the Holocaust anymore? A question like that doesn't have just one answer. When I stood in that Ukrainian schoolyard with my parents, I didn't ask my dad how he felt because I didn't want to know. I didn't ask about his brother because I was afraid he would tell me something I didn't want to hear. I didn't want to hear my dad's stories because I wanted to be able to live my life without his pain. I don't know how I'm supposed to read this book without picking up and carrying his pain with me. He said he wrote it for us, for me and my brother, but maybe by writing the book, he released us from having the sole responsibility of having to remember and tell his stories. I don't have to read my dad's book because you can. Now I'm done. I think I'm done. I suppose I should tell you to remember to pick up your lunches or fill out the conference survey form, but all I want to say is thank you all for listening.